Hello, it's me. Just kidding. That was my worst Adele impression ever that I could provide you folks. But today or now we're going to be talking about Goke, You're Not Lazy, Bored, or Unmotivated. We're also going to be talking about Peterson's Learned Helplessness. Just some notes to help generate thoughts and ideas for these readings. They're definitely a lot easier than Quintillion, right? But I still want to make sure that we are understanding the main points of these readings so that when we get to the discussion board and the essay, piece of cake, we'll be able to do them easily. So I'm going to switch to a share screen right now and go over the PowerPoints with you. They're pretty brief and straightforward, so that's always a nice thing, right? So we'll start with Peterson's Learned Helplessness. Here's what I would like for you to do, and this is a habit that I would like for you to get into with all of your reading. So as you're reviewing the reading, because Peterson is a sociologist, social psychologist who pioneered this concept of learned helplessness back in the 90s. Some of you may have heard of things like growth mindset, right? A lot of the research on growth mindset comes from this sort of vein of research. The difference is learned helplessness looks more at essentially like the systemic issues as to why we tend to feel stunted or stuck in our learning, whereas growth mindset only looks at the individual. So if you've heard growth mindset, this is kind of like the grandmommy to that. So in learned helplessness, as you're reading, when you review or as you read, right, anytime you encounter an unfamiliar word, you should draw a box around it or highlight it with a particular color. And then anytime you encounter important or noteworthy passages, you should underline that or highlight it with a different color, depending on, if you're reading it on your computer or if you're doing it, if you're printing everything out. And then in the margins, in your notes, wherever you write your notes, whether they're on the page, if you have a fancy computer that does that on the, on the little screen here, or if you do them like on a notes page, write both your intellectual and your emotional responses, not just what you think or summarizing, but also how you feel. And Peterson is a good one to do this with because Peterson gets us to thinking about a lot of things, but he also gets us to feeling a lot of ways, right? Because some of these vignettes that he goes through, we can relate to those as students, as people who live lives, et cetera, et cetera. So get in the habit of doing these things, boxing unfamiliar words, and then don't just box them, but once you have them and you have your focus on them, once you get to the end of that paragraph or the end of that reading, go back, look up the definition, reread that sentence or that paragraph in context now that you know what that word means. A lot of people go like, oh, I was learned you just skip over the word. Don't do that. Do not do that. Don't rely solely on your context clues. You should really understand a text inside and out at this point. Does it take a little bit of time at first? Yes, everything does, right? But once you get into that habit and you start to strengthen your vocabulary by understanding what more and more and more of these words mean, then you can employ and apply that vocabulary to your own writing. And you start to sound smarter, you start to sound more academic, you start to feel like you're part of this community, right? This is, whenever people tell me like, how do I become a better writer? Having good reading skills is one of the best ways to do it. And this is it, right? Learning those new words and not just skipping over them. And then making sure, again, that you understand what it's saying, that you kind of get the main points, and that you know what your intellectual and emotional response is. So after you read Learned Helplessness, go back to it and look at kind of each story or vignette that Peterson shares. And by vignette, I mean like these different stories of these different people who experience different aspects of learned helplessness that are discussed in this reading, right? make sure you're able to summarize each one in your own words. You know, whenever students see summarize, they just go, oh, I'll just cut and paste, you know, whatever it says. That's lazy, and we don't want to be lazy anymore, right? Put it in your own words. Again, does it take a little bit of work? Does it take a little bit of time? At first, yes, but once you get good at it, you can do it in your head like that. So start to get into that habit. Then answer, how does this vignette reflect the theory of learned helplessness and the major aspects, contingency, cognition, and behavior that Peterson discusses on page 8? Again, intellectual response, right? Think about that. And then think, how can you relate these ideas to your own experience, especially as a college student? That's more that emotional response, right? So again, we're going to do this with Peterson, but you should be doing this with all of your readings. Doing these things, you know, boxing the unfamiliar words, underlining the important passages, being able to summarize, knowing what your intellectual response is, but also knowing how you feel about a thing. And when you think about how you feel, really try to get out of that pattern of just, I agree or I disagree, right? Try to apply it to something. Try to analyze it. Try to think about more complex feelings than just, you know, plus or minus, good or bad, right? Get out of those sort of very static, very generalized ways of thinking into something more complicated, right? Something a little savvier.